It's impossible to pinpoint any one beginning spot as the start of the space race. The space race as it happened was such an incredibly specific and peculiar combination of events and individuals, entirely tied to the time in which they happened, that it likely couldn't have happened at any other point in history. Just as much as landing on the moon required Mercury and Gemini before Apollo could succeed, landing on the moon also likely couldn't have happened without the post-colonial period, or the Bay of Pigs, or the Soviet Union being devastated as it was after World War II. So, when the space race came to be, the individuals who were there to witness it were in an incredibly lucky position of seeing a warlike effort of resources mobilized into one scientific and engineering achievement that's been unrivaled since. However, those individuals during that time became aware that the good days could not last forever. NASA knew, even back in the days of Mercury and Gemini, that they would not have Apollo-level funds forever. In the Soviet Union, things were different still. The space race consisted of disconnected efforts based on who was in favor with the lever pullers in power. And individuals on both sides of the Iron Curtain understood that once the first step was taken in the lunar soil, they would be facing a strange and uncharted period of having to fight for resources and projects. Now, we have the benefit of hindsight. We see what happened. We know that in America, post-Apollo became the Space Shuttle Orbiter, launched by 2 solid rocket boosters with liquid fuels powering its main engines. In the Soviet Union and later in Russia, the Soyuz continued to be used, and manned spacecraft efforts followed that program, as well as the program of Salyut space stations. In the Soviet Union and later Russia, they continued with their Soyuz spacecraft, refining and updating it, and later going on to the Salyut series of space stations. But back during the period of the mid-1960s and the early 70s, there was a lot of different and sometimes wise, sometimes unwise ideas about the best directions in which to take crewed spaceflight. And so, using the Cosmospheres collection, we'll explore some of those ideas and their executions, some that were so far away from being developed that they never made it off the drawing board, and some that made it all the way to being flown and were just barely cut short. Regardless of how far along a mission got, we'll use the Cosmospheres collection, one of the largest collections of space artifacts in the world, to explore Soviet and American mission planning in a post-Apollo 11 world. This story of missions that never were doesn't begin with Apollo 11, but that mission serves as the focus point for many of them. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become the first humans to take steps on another celestial body. Humanity has just become a species of more than one place in space. Of course, what this means for those on the ground is jubilation, followed by a feeling of, what now? NASA had its immediate future assured for Apollo missions, but it had to begin deciding its future by drawing on studies that had already been underway for many years. And in the Soviet Union, moon missions, even if they had been funded to a point where they could have been carried out, were many years away from being completed. And infighting assured that there was no one path to the moon had the Soviets been able to take it. The future for missions to space was anything but clear when Neil Armstrong set his booted foot down in the lunar regolith. NASA's post-Apollo troubles actually began long before Apollo 11. In 1966, NASA experienced the peak year of its funding in its entire history, when in that year, it took up 4.41% of the entire federal budget. People have this misconception about NASA that it occupies multiple percentage points of the federal budget. In fact, a Gallup poll taken the late years of the 2010s found that most people thought NASA had too much budget. But if NASA were to have just 2 or 3%, they'd be okay with that. In reality, today, NASA takes up less than 0.5% of the federal government's whole budget. Back in 1967, when NASA's budget started declining for the first time in years, one of the ways that NASA handled this problem was by shutting down the Saturn V production line. The Saturn V production line, it was assumed, could resume at some point once NASA had more funding, though within NASA it was also known that the technical knowledge and expertise required to assemble such a complicated rocket would be lost in several years if the production line did not resume. And it never did. The Saturn V, intended for Apollo 20, was set aside to be used for Skylab, and NASA's cuts to the post-Apollo world began even before Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969. As Apollo's budgetary vice continued to tighten, further mission cancellations were inevitable. At one point, there was even a fear that every mission after Apollo 14 would be canceled. Now, this did not come to be. NASA managed to arrange for its long-duration missions, Apollos 15, 16, and 17. But unfortunately, Apollos 18 and 19 also planned long-duration missions using the extended LEM and a rover were canceled. Their Saturn V's already in various stages of production, but completing the rockets and ultimately assembling and launching them was a cost that NASA could not meet with its many, many, many man-hours to get them from their assembly sites to the Cape and to the launch pad. Apollo 17 became the last mission to fly to the moon. When the Apollo 17 crew was initially selected, it was to be astronauts Gene Cernan, Joe Engle flying the lunar module with Cernan, and Ron Evans flying the command module. But ultimately, pressure from the scientific community and inside NASA forced the replacement of Joe Engle with Apollo 18's LEM pilot, scientist astronaut and geologist Dr. Harrison Schmitt, known as Jack. When Jack Schmitt was assigned to the final Apollo mission, and when it became clear that there would be no more lunar exploration for some time, he proposed several ambitious plans for this final in the Apollo series. For example, he proposed following the Surveyor 7 spacecraft to land in the Tycho crater, which is the most visible crater on the moon's near side. But even more daring, he proposed a landing on the far side of the moon, which had never been landed on by any spacecraft, robotic or otherwise. To achieve this, there would have been a single launch of a Titan rocket. The Titan would have carried a pair of communications satellites, which ultimately would have been sent into orbit around the moon to enable continuous communication with the astronauts, even while on the lunar far side. Ultimately, these plans were rejected as being too dangerous by NASA, and ultimately Apollo 17 would land in the Taurus Littrow Valley, itself a boxed-in canyon and quite an adventurous landing for a pair of space explorers, even if it wasn't quite as risky as the far side landing that Schmitt dreamed of. Many different mission modes were proposed for Apollo in order to make the most out of each flight to the moon. Now, while some of Schmitt's ideas were disregarded as being too dangerous or not achievable within time and budgetary constraints, improvements were made to the Apollo capsule and the Apollo spacecraft that over time allowed it to achieve more with each flight that got it to the moon, whether that was new engineering objectives or new scientific achievements. And one such improvement was the addition to Apollo of the SIM bay. The SIM bay, or Scientific Instrument Module Bay, was installed on an unused sector of the Apollo service module, and this bay was designed to carry a variety of different scientific survey and mapping equipment. Naturally, you had an Apollo spacecraft in orbit around the moon during each lunar landing mission, so why not use that time it was spent in orbit performing detailed scientific observation of the lunar surface? The SIM bay was used on Apollos 15, 16, and 17. But ultimately, Apollo 17 almost received a very different mission proposal than what it got. There was an idea to use the SIMBay and its instruments to perform a detailed polar set of observations of the moon. Now, there's only one problem with this plan, which is that if you send an Apollo spacecraft into a polar orbit around the moon, a lunar landing becomes impossible. Due to the particular way that any planetary body spins, an orbiting spacecraft above it is not over the same point that it was from one orbit to the next, unless you send it to a farther stationary orbit. And so an orbiting Apollo spacecraft would not have been over the exact same point to allow the LEM to rendezvous and dock if it was in a polar orbit. Had Apollo 17 been sent into a polar orbit, there never would have been a lunar landing. Instead, they would have used a polar orbit and an observation period of approaching 2 weeks to fully map one of the moon's sides, performing detailed observations that had never been done, particularly on the far northern and far southern regions of the moon. Then they would have left behind a camera that would have mapped the other side as they themselves returned to Earth. But ultimately, this plan was disregarded in favor of a plan that maximized the returns on lunar surface observations and scientific experiments. And Apollo 17 did land on the moon, becoming, of course, the last mission to do so. While America racked up success after success in lunar orbit and on the surface of the moon, the Soviet Union had fallen far behind in the space race. And just as America's success was dependent on the specific combination of circumstances that led to Project Apollo, the Soviet Union's lack of success was dependent on the same. When the Soviet Union started launching their major space spectaculars, the Sputniks, Vostoks, those efforts were spearheaded by a design bureau within the Soviet Union called OKB-1, and its leader, its chief designer, was a man by the name of Sergei Korolev. Now, Korolev helped create the conditions for these space spectaculars by selling them to the Soviet government and military as effective tools of propaganda to prove the superiority of the Marxist-Leninist way of life. And with this salesmanship, he achieved things like Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space on Vostok 1. But here we encounter the fundamental problem of Soviet mission planning during the Apollo years as well as after, which was that the Soviets never had an equivalent to NASA. There was never a central agency within the Soviet Union that existed to choose one mission above all else and direct all planning and funds to that goal. Instead, space missions were decided based on who was in favor with those in power, based on who had the ear of Khrushchev or later on Leonid and Brezhnev. And because of this fractured nature of the effort, once Sergei Korolev was no longer the top dog in the Soviet space program, space efforts fractured. Beginning in the early 1960s, even as the Vostok program was continuing, Korolev began to fall out of favor with Khrushchev. And so when he proposed a moon landing program consisting of a new ultra-large rocket called the N-1 and a new spacecraft called the Soyuz, or Union, his proposal did not become the guiding force for Soviet space planning. Instead, his rivals proposed other missions, and funding was spread out between a variety of different missions in the mid-1960s. Now, in late 1965, after Khrushchev had been removed from power, Korolev did manage to regain control of the Soviet space efforts under his OKB-1 design bureau. But he would die only several months later because of a surgery in which he developed uncontrollable bleeding. His deputy, Vasily Mishin, took over the OKB-1 design bureau, but Mishin was not nearly as effective a manager and salesman as Korolev had been. And so funding and support for the space programs put forth by OKB-1 began to dwindle. With decreasing funds and support, and without the leadership of its visionary director who had led it through some of the greatest space successes in world history, Vasily Mission and OKB-1 were left with the N-1 and the Soyuz. Now, the Soyuz was under planning and testing for many years before its first flight in 1967. And in a darker irony, 1967 would be a year that would see two space tragedies, the only year to see two. The Apollo 1 fire in January, and then Soyuz 1 in April, which killed its lone cosmonaut, Vladimir Komarov. But even with that failure, development on Soyuz and its N-1 rocket continued notionally for the moon program. Now, Soyuz would not have flown to the moon in this form, in its Earth orbital form, which is roughly the form that we know it in today, making flights to the ISS, although updated, of course, since the 1970s. It would have taken the form of the Soyuz LOK, which stood for Luny Orbitalny Kорабль, or Lunar Orbital Craft. The LOK had no solar panels. The solar panels were replaced by fuel cells, and it had more expendables for the longer trip to the moon and back. The N-1 would have boosted the Soyuz LOK along with an LK moon lander and a Block D rocket stage to the moon. Once at the moon, the Soyuz LOK, which was stacked on top of the LK, which was stacked on top of the Block D, would enter lunar orbit, where one of the two cosmonauts inside the LOK would spacewalk over to the LK moonlander, which for weight reasons had no capability to fully dock to the LOK mothership and form a connecting tunnel. Then the LK moonlander and the Block D would detach. The Block D would slow down the two craft as they approached the lunar surface and then be dropped to crash into the lunar surface. And ultimately, the LK moonlander would land on the surface of the moon. The LK moonlander has one interesting distinguishing feature from the Apollo LEM, which is that unlike the Apollo LEM's separate descent and ascent engines, the LK moonlander carried only one engine. That one engine was nestled inside of its landing legs, which, like the LEM, would be left behind on the moon when the LK lifted off. But unlike the LEM, there weren't fuel tanks for the engine inside the legs. The legs were mostly just a support framework, and everything needed to land on the moon for the engine, as well as get off the moon again, was contained in the upper ascent stage. The lone cosmonaut on the moon would conduct observations and do whatever it is a cosmonaut on the moon does. And then back in the LK would lift off with that one engine and get back up into space to the LOK mothership, where then they would discard the LK and return to Earth, much as Apollo did. Interestingly enough, this lunar orbit rendezvous mode of getting to the moon, of taking a mothership, which stays in lunar orbit, and a separate ship to go down to the moon's surface and then ascend, was independently a mode reached by both the Americans and the Soviets. Evidence suggests that the Soviet decision was not influenced by the Americans. Instead, they both decided that that was the mode which made the most mission sense. Of course, none of this matters that much because the LK moonlander and the LOK Soyuz never were developed to the point that they would have needed to be to support a moon landing. Far before they were able to make flights with humans, both were dropped. The LK moonlander did make several unmanned test flights in Earth orbit. And one of the N-1 rockets, one of the 4 N-1 rockets that launched and failed, did carry an LK moonlander, but that was about as far as the program got. Now, while a Soyuz never flew to the moon, a version of the Soyuz did, a version called Zond. Zond is a often overlooked part of space history, but it was a Soviet last attempt at stealing a first away from the Americans. Of course, as the 1960s progressed and Gemini turned into Apollo, it became clear that the Americans were going to be able to attempt a circumlunar flight at some point. As far back as 1961, both the Soviets and the Americans identified a circumlunar flight as a possible show-stopping spectacular for the world stage. Not one quite as amazing as a lunar landing, but one that could be achieved for far less cost in terms of rocket development and fuel. So the Soviets decided to develop one last Hail Mary by using a Soyuz as the basis for a new spacecraft. The spacecraft would be put into space aboard a Proton rocket. Zond saw the Soyuz's bottom descent module and its upper reentry module go into space, but without its final orbital module. The orbital module provides extra living space for the cosmonauts. On a circumlunar Zond flight, the Proton rocket was not powered enough to lift a full Soyuz with orbital module to the moon, and so the orbital module was removed. With just the descent module and the lower engine module, a Zond could swing once around the moon without entering lunar orbit and ultimately return to the Earth. And the Soviets did launch Zond several times. Once the Soviets dropped any ideas of a lunar landing or even a lunar flyby, they did take a different tack than the Americans. Rather than abandon their Soyuz and try and develop a new spacecraft, as the Americans developed the space shuttle after Apollo, the Soviets decided to continue trying to upgrade their space hardware. They took Soyuz, and over the decades, they've improved it, replaced pieces of it that were outdated, made it a continually lighter and more efficient craft. And today, it's arguably the most reliable spacecraft in human history. This provides an interesting thought experiment for the future. What if, instead of switching from Apollo to a new program, to the space shuttle, NASA had made the decision to stick with Apollo hardware, even if that would have kept NASA in low Earth orbit for the foreseeable future with lower powered and cheaper Saturn 1B rockets. It's what ended up happening with the space shuttle anyways. So it's a bit of an interesting food for thought of where things might be today if NASA had kept with Apollo and upgraded its hardware instead of changing tracks to something new. In 1962, NASA made a crucial decision when it selected North American as the prime contractor for the Apollo spacecraft. Now, this came as somewhat of a shock to McDonnell, who had at that point already built the Mercury spacecraft and was designing and building the incoming Gemini spacecraft. They thought they would be a natural pick for America's third spacecraft, but instead the contract went to North American. The Gemini program, of course, would fly for 2 years in 1965 and 1966 and was wildly successful with 10 crewed flights, all of which achieved to some extent their objectives and which saw relatively few failures with the spacecraft itself. And so following the Gemini program, McDonnell began proposing new uses of the Gemini spacecraft, hoping to take their reliable workhorse and extend and expand it for use in future NASA manned missions and also in a way that would give them new contracts. One of those proposals was known as Big Gemini, or as the astronauts would have called it, Big Gemini. Big Gemini said that taking the basic Gemini spacecraft, you could expand this cone, taking these portions here where the reentry engines and the crucial life support functions and thrusters are housed, and removing them to expand back where a manned cabin would be housed. This expansion to the Gemini capsule allowed it to fit on top of a Saturn 1B or a Saturn V, primarily a Saturn 1B so it could function as a cargo vehicle. Furthermore, then, you could take the rear of the conical section and put an additional cylindrical cabin on it to allow for even more space for humans or cargo. This proposal would have turned Gemini into a new reliable cargo vehicle or vehicle for getting humans into space to provide crews for space stations like Skylab. Ultimately, this proposal by McDonnell took a couple different forms, but none of them panned out. Gemini was the spacecraft of the past, not the way of the future. Now, for its part, Gemini did not only see proposals put forth by McDonnell. The US Air Force was established at the close of World War II, and they immediately began exploring the scientific and engineering aspects of high flight. Of course, a famous example of this exploration is their series of X-planes, specifically the X-1, which in 1947 conducted the first supersonic sustained flight. The X-1 was only the beginning in a series of research flights that the Air Force would begin to conduct to go higher and further. And of course, once you've gone high enough and far enough, you leave the Earth and get into space. So The Air Force saw space as an extension of their domain. Their region, they rationalized, was not just the air, but also space. In fact, the term aerospace was originally coined by the Air Force to help tie the exploration of outer space to their exploratory missions in the air. But those plans came to an end in 1958, when the Eisenhower administration and the U.S. Congress ultimately signed into law the National Aeronautics and Space Act, establishing NASA and giving NASA control of all space projects that were not explicitly related to the national defense. So ultimately, the Air Force, as well as the Army and the Navy, lost out on their immediate dream of exploring space. But they had efforts underway, and what efforts they had continued, and they didn't let their efforts stop there. Already underway was the X-15. The X-15 was the world's very first space plane. Now, I don't mention it as an example here of something that was unsuccessful, because it was, in fact, very successful. And 2 of the flights in its program broke through the Kármán line, making it technically the 3rd spacecraft to reach space. However, it was what would follow on the X-15 that was not quite so successful. The X-15 was intended as a technology demonstrator, a suborbital rocket plane that would ultimately lead to a later effort, what the Air Force called Dyna-Soar. Now, Dyna-Soar was spelled with a Y, and Dyna and Soar were 2 separate words. Dyna for dynamic, Soar for soaring. The idea behind Dyna-Soar was a manned space plane that would be mounted on top of a Titan ICBM, launched into space with the capability of orbiting the Earth and coming down at a runway to land like a conventional aircraft. Dyna-Soar had different proposed missions, ranging from scientific and exploratory to defense and even nuclear. Dyna-Soar would ultimately be canceled, as it was seen as a project that lacked a sufficiently convincing base in the national defense. But it would not be the last time that the Air Force was allowed to pursue a space project separate from NASA. One proposal by the Air Force and McDonnell was that of the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MAL. The MAL program would have seen an upgraded Titan rocket launch into orbit a workshop with a Gemini spacecraft mounted on top. Now, the program's objectives were initially purely scientific, as the Air Force looked to keep itself in the space game without ceding all of the territory to NASA. But later on, the objectives of MAL became much more military in nature. To launch such a large payload, Titan would have had to have been not only elongated, but also augmented by 2 solid rocket boosters mounted on the side, making it into a truly powerful launcher. One such Titan in this configuration was tested for the MAL program. The workshop on top would have carried a variety of different scientific equipment and later observation equipment, cameras for performing videographic and pictorial analysis of the Soviet Union. At the time, of course, spy satellites were entirely film-based, and their film had to be brought back on re-entry capsules. Aiming them was sometimes a hit-or-miss game, and so with humans on board a laboratory who could aim them and pack the film into the Gemini capsule on top for re-entry, there was a lot more of a military gain to be seen from a space station of this type. But in the end, MAL ended up dead because you just can't quite top what you can get from an unmanned satellite. As photographic analysis from orbit advanced and satellites became more and more sophisticated, there was less and less of a justification for a man inside a spacecraft taking photos, if that's all that they were up there to do. MAL was eventually canceled, and the Air Force was once again left without a space objective of their own to compete with those of NASA. An essential piece of the MAL program was an upgraded version of the Gemini capsule that the Air Force creatively dubbed Gemini-B. Now, it differed from Gemini in some subtle ways, different from our Gemini 10 capsule here, Gemini B was not designed with any long duration capabilities. While the Gemini program was originally meant to test extended missions up to 2 weeks, Gemini B was only intended to be used during the first day or two and the last day or two of a MAL mission, so it had no need to be in space for that long. Gone were the equipment that would let astronauts live for longer periods in space. MAL Gemini was also not designed for rendezvous and docking. Since it would go into space mounted on top of the laboratory, there was no need to find something else in space. But one of the most crucial differences was the manner by which the astronauts inside would access the laboratory. Since Gemini B went into space on top of the laboratory and did not have docking capability, the astronauts would access not through the front, as we're used to with Apollo, but instead through the rear. In between the seats of Gemini was a new feature, a hatch that went straight through to Gemini B's heat shield, and from there into the laboratory itself. This was a feature that was heavily doubted in the days of development for Gemini B, because it wasn't seen as possible by some that a Gemini with that opening cut in its heat shield could re-enter through the atmosphere. Of course, Gemini B did prove its worth on 2 unmanned test flights, and ultimately, the heat shield hatch was something that did not cause fiery destruction for the capsule, and it wouldn't mean death for future astronauts riding inside of it. As mentioned previously, the Soviets took a different tack from the Americans in taking their existing hardware and upgrading it over time, and America chose to go a new route with the space shuttle. But there were ideas in NASA leading up to Apollo 11 and following the first moon landing on how Apollo hardware could be repurposed. That was the mission of what was originally known as Apollo X and later became called the Apollo Applications Program. The Apollo Applications Program looked at how you could take pieces of hardware like the Command and Service Module or the Lunar Module and redesign them for new missions. And after all, why not? It made sense after NASA and its contractors had each independently spent billions of dollars developing these pieces of equipment to go to the moon, to try to take and find new missions for those pieces of equipment. Unfortunately, little came out of Apollo applications, but many of the ideas that did are quite interesting. One such intended reuse of Apollo hardware did not use the lunar rover, but it attempted to solve the same problem. So, of course, the lunar rover was developed to provide the astronauts greater mobility on the surface. Mobility studies for Apollo date back to the early 1960s, when there were a lot of different ideas on how the astronauts could get around. Before NASA arrived at a traditional 4-wheeled vehicle, the ideas ranged from much of the same to somewhat different, like 6-wheeled vehicles, to radically different, like large pogo-legged walkers, to not surface vehicles at all, but instead little personal LEMs that would allow the astronauts to hop around to different areas on the surface. Of course, the rover won out because it's the safest, easiest to develop option. And NASA's lunar rover was developed in less than 2 years and had a fantastic track record on the missions it flew. But there were studies in the mid-1960s for something that NASA wanted to make called the MOLAB. MOLAB stands for Mobile Laboratory. It's tough to point to one form of the MOLAB because the MOLAB never quite moved past the developmental phases. But basically, it aimed to provide an enclosed shirt sleeves environment. To allow greater lunar exploration, the astronauts would use the MOLAB to move around on the lunar surface without needing to rely on Apollo's walk-back distance. The walk-back distance was the need dictated by the amount of oxygen and other consumables in their spacesuits that mandated how far the astronauts could move outside the LEM. On Apollos 15, 16, and 17, they would, on several of their EVAs, drive as far as they could walk back at the beginning of an EVA, and then visit sites on the rover that got closer and closer back to the LEM as they ate through their consumables. MOLAB would eliminate all of that, allowing the astronauts to go farther and farther away from the LEM than they ever could before. And MOLAB looked not just at creating a new vehicle for the moon, but also at reusing existing Apollo technology, such as adapting the command module for use on the moon, or even adapting the lunar module itself so that it could be used as a mobile laboratory. Regardless of the engineering difficulties of these plans, and all of them had difficulties, MOLAB ran up against one insurmountable obstacle. To send humans and a MOLAB to the moon, you would need 2 Saturn V launches, one to get the humans down and one to get the MOLAB down. And in the dwindling days of Apollo funding, that challenge was one that could not be met. Increased studies of the moon were not the only thing proposed in America. Back in 1961, shortly after Gagarin, when John F. Kennedy was asking how the United States could catch up, one of his prime proposals was a space station. Space stations as an idea had been around since the conception of the idea of the exploration of space. Von Braun himself had proposed space stations in a myriad of different forms, even before Kennedy asked if a space station would be enough to beat the Russians. So ultimately, NASA arriving at the idea of constructing an orbiting laboratory was an obvious next step to take, and proposals for that kind of plan took a variety of different forms. Ultimately, during the 1960s, von Braun proposed 2 different versions of a space station using Saturn V hardware, the wet workshop and also the dry workshop. So the basic concept behind a wet workshop is you launch a rocket into space, and then once it's in orbit, you drain the fuel tanks of any remaining propellants, and you build a living space inside of it. And this was what von Braun proposed to do with either a Saturn V with its second S2 stage, or a Saturn 1B with its second S4B stage. But later on in Apollo, a different plan emerged, that of the dry workshop. The dry workshop was the proposal that you could launch a rocket with one stage already cleared out of propellants and with a living space already built inside of it, allowing you to send up more specialized scientific equipment. This would ultimately become Skylab. Skylab saw the launch of a single Saturn V into Earth orbit without an Apollo spacecraft or a lunar module on top. The Saturn V was able to loft its S4B into orbit with no fuels and a space station built inside. Ultimately, Skylab was the only thing to ever come out of the Apollo applications program. No other plan came to pass after the Nixon administration canceled any further efforts by Apollo applications. But Skylab was not the only proposed use of an S4B. A different, far more ambitious plan called for a manned flyby of Venus in the 1970s. A single Saturn V would be able to launch into Earth orbit. Instead of carrying a dry workshop like Skylab, it would have been a wet workshop where the S4B would have had propellants. Mounted on top, a single Apollo spacecraft, and in the conical housing that normally held the LEM, all the components needed to build a space station inside the S4B. Now, you don't actually need much more propellant to send a spacecraft to another planet as you do to the moon. So the S4B would have been able to propel its Apollo spacecraft on the way to Venus, at which point any remaining propellants would be drained, and the stage would then find itself becoming a space station. The astronauts would coast along about 4 months to Venus. They would have a very short flyby releasing several probes, and then they would have 8 months back home, during which time they would perform detailed medical observations of long duration weightlessness on the human body and observations of other celestial objects like the sun. This would have launched in the early 1970s, although an even more ambitious plan in the late 1970s called for a flyby of Mars and Venus on the outbound leg, and Venus again on the return leg to Earth. That second plan would have taken well over 2 years, while this first plan would have only taken about a year. Ultimately, as support for Apollo waned, so did support for detailed, large-scale, ambitious plans like a Venus flyby, though it's certainly fun to imagine. Ultimately, the manned flyby of Venus being canceled has somewhat of a silver lining. The cycles of the sun at the time were poorly understood, and the launch window for the early 1970s manned flyby of Venus would have had the astronauts coming back home during a massive coronal mass ejection, a release of charged particles from the sun that would have seriously injured or possibly even killed them on their journey home, a reality that's explored in the alternate history book Island of Clouds. One of the key components of the manned Venus flyby plan involved the use of the spacecraft LEM adapter, the conical area where the LEM sat, to store the equipment that would be needed to convert the S-4B stage into a space station. And in order to maximize the effective use of space within that adapter, the service module's main engine was a bit too large. So the plan called for taking the service module's large engine and replacing it entirely. The service module, in part, had such a large engine because in the very early days of Apollo, it was unclear how exactly the moon landing would be achieved, but the thinking was that the entire Apollo spacecraft would land on the moon. So part of the reason for the service module's giant engine was to help achieve this. Later on, that was disregarded, but the engine was kept as part of the spacecraft's design. This huge engine takes up a lot of space, though. And so ultimately, this engine would have been removed and replaced with two of the lunar module descent engines, both shorter and smaller, but together capable of providing the needed thrust to help the command and service module perform maneuvers during the Venus flyby mission, saving space while also utilizing existing hardware to achieve mission objectives. All elements of Apollo hardware were considered for reuse under the Apollo Applications Program, and one very inventive idea was to use the LEM as a space telescope. This would be called the Apollo Telescope Mount, and the idea was that a LEM would be stripped of its legs and engines so that its octagonal descent stage could be used to house a telescope, which would then be operated using the cabin and its existing control systems, which could be integrated into the telescope. So an Apollo telescope could have launched on a Saturn V, right in the place where the LEM would normally be, with an Apollo spacecraft docking to it, and then using it to perform more detailed observations of our solar system or beyond. This program didn't make it that far past the planning stage, but its legacy lives on. An Apollo telescope was ultimately included on Skylab, and if you look at the shape of the Apollo telescope mount included on Skylab, it's a familiar one, a boxy octagon, just like the descent stage of the lunar module. 1973 saw the launch of Skylab space station, but it was not the only Skylab in existence. Two Skylab stations were actually made, both converted from S-4B stages of smaller Saturn S-1B rockets. And either Skylab could have been launched. One existed as a backup to the other. Now, of course, only one was launched. The station itself had some issues, and it lived out its life as America's first space station. But had a Saturn V or the funding existed, a second Skylab could have been launched. And interesting proposals as to what to do with this second Skylab arose, including turning the second Skylab into an outgrowth of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, continuing cooperation with the Soviets. Ultimately, these plans would have seen a Skylab docking with a Soyuz spacecraft, or possibly even the combination of a Skylab and Salyut space station coming together to form the world's first space station, an international space station, if you will. Now, of course, these didn't come to pass. Skylab B, as the second Skylab is known, is currently in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and can be viewed for an idea of what the interior of Skylab looked like. Setting aside any of the various isolated and somewhat scattered plans for reuse of Apollo hardware or other missions that NASA had, NASA knew that following Apollo, it had to come up with something big. What comes next? What follows on to Apollo? And what it proposed to the Nixon administration was called the Integrated Program Plan, or the IPP. The IPP was an extremely ambitious plan that called for at least one space station, a fleet of space shuttles, sustained habitation of the moon with a moon base, and ultimately a landing on Mars by the 1980s. The space shuttle was seen as the workhorse of the IPP. It would be a low-cost, reusable way of shuttling people and materials into outer space and into orbit. Materials that would then be used to build space stations, or at least one space station, and a separate set of shuttles. These shuttles would have been designed entirely for travel between the Moon and Mars, and based around something called the Nerva. The Nerva was a nuclear rocket engine. By using nuclear fuels, you can obtain a far higher bang for your buck to get any payload mass between Earth and the Moon or Earth and Mars. So with these nuclear shuttles, low-cost transportation to the Moon and to Mars would have been possible, enabling the building of a moon base to test out techniques for humans to survive on the surface of another world for sustained amounts of time. And all of these pieces would have come together, several Nerva shuttles and a new lander to allow NASA to mount a Mars mission. It was extremely ambitious. It saw an achievement of a long-term humanity goal, landing on another planet, exploring a place that is, at least more so than the Moon, a bit likely to hold life. But the IPP was very out of touch with the reality of the government at the time. Johnson's Great Society had become massively expensive. The Vietnam War was sucking down money, and Americans just weren't passionate about space exploration like they had been during the mid-1960s. So ultimately, even as NASA presented the IPP, they proposed scaled-back versions of the plan. And what the Nixon administration rewarded them was even less ambitious than those scaled-down versions. The Nixon administration was willing to commit only to the space shuttle. It was the single piece of the IPP that would survive. The Nerva engine, which was tested entirely to completion on the ground and ready for tests in space, was canceled. And there would be no nuclear shuttles, no moon base, and no Mars landing. Only the shuttle, which would of course prove to be NASA's workhorse for 30 years, from 81 to 2011. Once the Nixon administration had made the decision that NASA would receive only the space shuttle and nothing more, questions of its design were the main thing for NASA to address. There were many different proposals made for the space shuttle. Different companies all wanted to be the primary contractor on the space shuttle, so they put in to ultimately see if they could get the very lucrative bid that would hopefully extend for even longer than Apollo had. One design that came out primarily from the mind of legendary designer Max Faget was that of the DC-3, named after the same plane from many decades earlier. The DC-3 saw a two-rocket system, a booster rocket, and then the Space Shuttle Orbiter itself. So the orbiter would be mounted on the booster, both of them rolled out to the pad in a horizontal configuration, then raised to standing here. Using the same gantry tower as the Saturn V, they would have ultimately been boarded, although in some versions of the plan, the booster itself was unmanned. The booster and the orbiter would launch into space, and then once the booster had expended its fuel, it would detach and fly back down for a landing on a runway to be reused again as a booster, making the system consisting of two parts an entirely reusable system. Then the orbiter, continuing on to space, has a payload bay, just like the shuttle that came to be, and could ultimately take up satellites or space station pieces, the originally envisaged role of the shuttle. Ironically, the thing that would kill the DC-3 was the death of an entirely different program. The Air Force's Manned Orbiting Laboratory, MALL program, was canceled in 1969, ending the last major Air Force-only effort at space exploration. The MALL program was canceled because ultimately spy satellites advanced to a point at which you didn't need a human in space to take pictures. You could send up spy satellites for much, much cheaper to get roughly the same results. With the cancellation of the MALL program, the Air Force's needs ultimately would become folded into NASA's. As NASA was developing its space shuttle, and the DC-3 was a major contender to be the design, the Air Force got involved, and the Air Force demanded that the space shuttle have maximum cross-range capability. The cross-range capability is what allows the shuttle from a given orbit to make its way back to a given landing strip. With low cross-range capability, the shuttle would have a much more limited selection of orbits that it could take and still make its way back to a landing strip at Edwards or Kennedy. Whereas maximum cross-range capability would increase the orbits it could go to. And so when the Air Force's needs became a part of the shuttle program, maximum cross-range capability was a necessity. And unfortunately, the DC-3 could not offer it. In this model, two different options are laid out. The DC-3 with minimum cross-range capability and a delta wing design with maximum cross-range capability. The delta wing being, of course, the design that NASA chose to accommodate the needs of the Air Force. The space shuttle would go on to fly DoD missions, 4 of which are still classified as of the making of this video. And the cross-range capability demanded by the Air Force became a relevant and necessary part of the space shuttle's ultimate design. And so ultimately, we end where we began, not with what could have been, but with what was. Soyuz, Salyut, the space shuttle, Mir, Hubble, the ISS, everything that's happened over the last several decades. I think some of these projects sometimes get a bad rap for their imperfections, for the things that they failed to achieve. Take, for example, the space shuttle. The space shuttle was designed for a launch schedule that it never was able to achieve. It was designed for goals that never came to pass. And it was ultimately sold to the American public on a premise that was unrealistic. But I think it's very important to acknowledge that the projects that we did ultimately have, like Apollo, were a product of their time. They were a product of the people that were in power, the circumstances that surrounded them, and what their respective publics were willing to fund. Apollo was the result of an incredible fusion of the right circumstances. And the space shuttle and every other program was a result of the fusion of its circumstances too. It's nice to take a trip into the past and look at the wonderful things that people dreamed of doing in space. But I don't think that that should be at the expense of a realistic look at what space travel has always been, which is an animal born of its own circumstances and considerations like political and capital qualities. Ultimately, we can dream about where space travel could have gone. But it's really important for us to understand that the places it went have been majestic all the same. Places like the ISS. I, for one, am amazed at the ISS. It's the collaborative effort of 5 different space agencies. It's been visited by people from 19 countries at the time of this filming. Our dreams of the places that we could have gone should not supplant our appreciation for what we have had. We should demand better of our space programs, but we should also recognize that they've been to some amazing places, and the places that they have been necessarily born of the circumstances that they were in at the time. So, while the missed opportunities of the space race are tantalizing and frustrating, I think that the places that space exploration have gone and will continue to go are exciting too. And I, for one, look forward to the future, the international effort and collaboration that will bring about space in a way that we've only just begun to see. I'm excited for what space can bring. And I hope to see people back on the moon and on Mars within my lifetime, not as a pie-in-the-sky plan that won't come to be, but as a realistic plan born of its own circumstance, just like everything must be. Okay. All right, let's go.
My name is Koyalev. I show up in the pictures.
There we go. I always have my museum hand ready, which is where you have 2 fingers clasped together. I need to stop. Okay. And we'll explore You can't laugh like that. I thought, as soon as I said it, I thought, that's bad. That's no good. LOK, the Looney Orbital. I shouldn't have tried that. I knew what it was, and then hold on, let me pull it up here. So, by using up one of the quadrants of the service module that had previously, nope, not quadrants, there's 6 of them. Sectors. To start from the, oh! God, this thing's so fun. What do you mean, what? There's all these different cameras in here. There's different film. I didn't know that thing was on springs. Oh, look at it. In 1962, you can't laugh. If you laugh, I laugh. Sorry. Okay. In 1960.